Good, thank you, Charles, and good morning to everybody. There was a rumor that the private sector was going to stay away from Durban because they were so frustrated, and some did stay away, but you didn't, and thank you for that, because governments through the history of environmental policy making have rarely led. They have responded to demands from their citizens for change. And just as over the last 150 years of environmental policy making, we owe a huge debt of gratitude to NGOs, civil society, community groups who have systematically demanded change, so too increasingly we are seeing them being joined by business leaders who are saying, for heaven's sake, get on with it, give us clear signals, set tough policies, because we know the direction the future has to go. So the coalition between civil society, business leaders on this is very powerful. And if we are going to get the kind of global deal that we urgently need, then we need to demonstrate that success is not only necessary, but that it is possible. It's possible at scale, it's possible with reasonable cost, and it's possible in a way that enables jobs to be created and human lives to be enriched. So thank you. You might be frustrated, but at the same time, I actually believe you are bringing a great deal to this debate. Look, we believe that Durban can deliver decisions this week that will have substantial impact and will benefit hundreds of millions of people. This week, hopefully, a new set of technology centers that will help give access to developing countries to technology will be created, and in the coming months we'll see them come into existence. Decisions on adaptation will be made this week that will make it easier and more coherent for countries to get access to money and also to do the right thing on adaptation. Hopefully this week, although I certainly can't guarantee it, delegates will decide to incorporate agriculture into the convention in a proper and full way, in a way that up until now they have not. And African farmers have suffered as a result. They ought to be included as major beneficiaries, not because only they're going to be the most threatened by climate change, but actually because they can be a huge source of solution to climate change. Every single acre in Africa could sequester on average 1 ton of carbon for the next 5 years, for example, each year. This would make a huge difference. At the moment, under the convention, that's given no credit whatsoever. There are triple win things that can be done that will double yields for African farmers, that will make those yields more resilient to climate change, and will also sequester carbon. Why don't we just get on and do it? We need some help from the negotiators. We believe that the Green Fund will make progress this week. We're very hopeful that the starting gun will be fired. And we hope, of course, although certainly we wouldn't predict this, that there will be an agreement of some roadmap towards a global deal in the coming years. But I was asked to say a few words about a subject dear to your heart and mine, money. Money is important, and let me just briefly talk about the big picture, then the small picture, then maybe the blurry picture, and finally the hopeful picture. The big picture is that if you take the decade 2015 to 2025, say, and let me say I'm looking at things through the lens of developing countries. This applies equally well to rich countries, but they have to get on and solve their own problems. So let me talk about the developing countries, which includes all the emerging countries like China, India, and the BRICS, and so on. Each year in that period, about $10 trillion will be invested in developing countries every single year. Now that $10 trillion needs to be greened for climate change. It needs to be made more resilient. It needs to be made more low carbon. So farmers need to do things differently, manufacturers need to do differently, governments building roads need to do things differently, we need better hydromet. So of that 10 trillion, we need every single sector of that to be done different. So that's a big picture. Now it turns out that doing things greener than the old days will cost more in the short run. And roughly speaking, and we don't know these numbers, but roughly speaking, that 10 trillion will cost an extra 500 billion each year to get it right if we're really going to nail the problem. So that's 5% of the total amount of investment in developing countries. 500 billion. That's, if you like, the incremental cost. Now the question is, where will that come from? Well, actually, it'll mainly come from developing countries themselves. Farmers will have to adapt. Businesses will have to adapt. They're going to have to pay that money themselves. So sometimes when you hear, wait a minute, why don't the developing countries pay? Well, they're paying it already. They're already paying it. In fact, they're paying it in the large already. Last year, $250 billion worldwide were invested in renewable energy, of which more than half was in developing countries. 50 billion in China alone. Well, who paid for that 50 billion? Well, of that 50 billion, of course, some of that was incremental. So, for example, instead of building a coal-powered plant over here, they decided to build a solar plant here. That cost more than the coal plant would. That incremental cost has been borne overwhelmingly by China in that case. And so too, with feed-in tariffs in 40 developing countries today, overwhelmingly, the incremental cost is being paid by developing countries. So that's quite encouraging. So the 500 billion, but we do need some help from two additional sources. One is from the public purse of rich countries. And that, in a way, is what all the discussion in here about. Two, it needs to come from private investors in rich countries that are going to invest in developing countries. Why? Why would they do it? Why would they take a loss? Why would they spend more investing in something that's green rather than something that's not? Because they want to be leaders and they see cost curves coming down and they see that actually they can become technology leaders in this field. So let's focus a little bit on the public side now. Now at Copenhagen, you remember, the 100 billion was promised. Some people thought that was all public, but now it's very clear that that wasn't the plan, that in fact it's public, it's private, and it's carbon markets. But it puts it in perspective a little. If the incremental cost is 500 billion, then 100 billion, and these are all annual figures, remember, 100 billion is sort of what the rich countries have promised. That's the big picture, if you like. Let's come to the small picture, which is not very small, the Green Fund this week. I say small simply because compared to the 10 trillion that it needs to influence, the amount of money going through the Green Fund will be very, very small. Now, we're fairly optimistic, and I'm sure you are too. It's very encouraging that the proposal that the Transitional Committee made, which is written down in 7 pages, I'm sure you've read it, lays out the broad structure of the Green Fund, sensible idea, a board of 24 different countries, half developing, half rich, allocation of money to developing countries. They can choose how they receive their money. They can choose to have it intermediated through the UN or the World Bank or a regional development bank or some other agency, or they can request one of their own departments in their countries to become accredited to get the money directly. So a pretty sensible idea, and currently the plan is to have a facility for the private sector. Now this is extremely important that this facility is there, even although it's controversial. The reason it's important is because this fund needs to influence that whole 10 trillion investment. Of that 10 trillion, 60% of it is private money. So if you want to have any chance of addressing the problem, you have to have a facility that will engage with the private sector. So we're hopeful this will all go through, including the private sector wing. Now, the blurry part, the blurry picture, we actually don't know how much money will be in this fund, and we actually don't know how quickly it will get up and running. Now, how much money will be in the fund will simply depend upon how those that would put money into the fund perceive it to be. If it's designed in a heavy, bureaucratic, high-cost, slow sort of way, it simply won't attract the money that is required. Not because developed countries won't necessarily provide the money, but they'll choose to provide the money some other way. And that will be absolutely fine. And a year ago, I think there was a lot more sort of assumption that almost all of the money would go into the Green Fund. That just isn't the assumption anymore now. There are lots of other ways you could provide the money, through existing funds, through bilateral programs, directly to the private sector, lots of other ways. And so those who are going to be taking this forward, those 24 board members that hopefully will be appointed following Durban, those people have a very big responsibility to design the fund in an efficient way, because their jobs should be on the line according to how much money comes into the fund. If they design a good fund, we'll know. If they design a bad fund, we'll know. And so I'm not sure I'd want to be one of those 24, but I jolly well hope the right people are put on that and that they really do a good job. And the second area of uncertainty is speed. When will the first dollar or rand or yen leave the fund and actually make a difference on the ground? Now, the history of fund creation is that this takes a long time. Now, that is a problem because this is the make or break decade. This is the decade where if we do not make progress, we simply will fail over the long term. So we run the very, very serious risk that we're creating a fund, and if it goes to the course of traditional funds, it'll be 5 or 6 years after all the procedures have been set, after all the requirements have been set, all the buildings have been built and the staffing has been put in place. It'll be that long. And then we're heading towards 2020, and quite frankly, it'll be too late. So what is extremely important is that funds are available in this interim period so we can get on with the job. For example, the largest funds at the moment are the climate investment funds. They're run by the regional development banks and ourselves, and one of my privileges is to sort of oversee these. 6.5 billion, and they will leverage over 40 billion in clean and climate resilient investment. So not trivial, but not huge either. We've now allocated all of those money to 45 countries, but we still have other countries queuing up. We have countries that are coming to us. Nigeria has come to us and said, look, we want to do our urban transportation in a green way. Help us out just a little. We'd even be willing to borrow concessional money for it. Just help us out. And we have to say, no, there isn't any money left. We actually don't have any money in that fund that's available for allocation. So at the moment, we're going out and we're seeking some additional funding because we simply cannot allow these good plans to go unfunded at the present time. So it is very, very important that while we support very wholeheartedly the Green Fund, and the World Bank Group is privileged to be appointed as the interim trustee of the Green Fund, it's very important we go as fast as we can here, but it would be a dereliction of duty if we ignored the urgent needs today. And needs are of two kinds. There are plans that are prepared already that need to be financed and would make a huge difference in at least 30 countries ready to finance plans today. Second, there's another 100 countries that need some help taking what are currently broad policies and putting them into investable funds. So we need to get a real readiness and design facility up and running. So that's the blurry picture. Finally, the hopeful picture amidst all this gloom. And let me say, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with Morny, by the way, with his beautiful analogy of the cars. So whilst I want to end on a positive note, I do want to be quite clear that we think that currently we're failing in the fight against climate change. We really are not doing anywhere near enough. And our clients, the 150 countries in the developing world, are saying to us, for heaven's sake, I mean, this is something we need to act on now. And 130 of them have come to us and said, help us on climate change as one of your 2 or 3 biggest priorities. Africa needs to triple its food consumption by 2050, and that means it should triple its food production as well. At a time when, all other things being equal, its yields will fall. So this is a very, very critical time. Scientists expect over a meter rise in sea level. More than 1 billion people would have their lives made miserable as a result of that. Tomorrow we're meeting with the AOSIS group. This is a group of all the small island developing states. Of course they are frustrated because the evidence is that already the extreme weather events are getting strong. So that's the bad news. The good news is that around the developing world, and certainly also among some in the industrialized world, we're seeing innovation like we've never seen before. Yesterday, GLOBE, which is the Global Parliamentarians organization on climate change and environment, published a major book laying out new legislation around the world over the last year alone. It's remarkable what parliamentarians are doing and what some governments are doing. Over 100 countries have targets for renewable energy. They don't need to. They don't have legal international obligations. They're choosing to do it. China this year doesn't need to impose upon itself a cap-and-trade system, but it is in 4 cities and 3 provinces, and it'll go national in 2015. Another 30 developing countries this year are experimenting with all kinds of interesting market-based instruments for climate change, and they're asking our support and the support of others. So there is great hope out there. The problem is it doesn't yet add up to anything like enough. Some people like to position the whole debate on climate change as if negotiators need to somehow start, a stationary vehicle and move it into gear. That's not the way to look at it. The train is already moving along the tracks. If you add green transportation, last year 550 billion was spent on energy and clean transportation in the world, of which over 200 billion was in the developing world. So it's not that we have to start something from scratch. We have to learn from remarkable successes, and then what the negotiators need to do is to create a framework in which that train can accelerate. And all around the world, governments are starting also to build their own regulatory environments. And that's not only central governments, it's cities, it's local governments, and it's community-driven governments as well. So look, we're optimistic. We wish you the best in the coming day during this. Thank you very much indeed.